huge gun that can shoot a shell miles from where it's at, right? And so they had invested in this really heavy artillery, and they had also created U-boats, submarines, which were a new weapon, right? These basically invisible ships that could sink a regular ship without that regular ship ever knowing that there was a threat. And anyway, things like this lead to a type of warfare called trench warfare, which we use as like the absolute symbol of the futility of war, because once people start getting mowed down, like originally, once the war first starts, we're organized just like we used to be with old wars, right? You'd have your cavalry on horseback, and you'd have some infantry, and then in the back you'd have some cannons, right? And then people start getting mowed down with machine guns, and you realize, whoa, we have to reorganize. And so, faced with these new weapons, we start digging holes in the ground so that we can fight, we can hide, and then fight. And the Germans had a plan that involved them sweeping quickly through France, thinking that Russia would take their time to get involved and that France wouldn't be able to respond quickly enough. It didn't work out, and they got bogged down really quickly, and the Russians entered on the other side, and they had to pull their forces from the Western Front to the Eastern Front, and it created the trench warfare system, and they evolved to be very complex, right? With a frontline trench, and they had to be designed in a certain way so that if somebody did drop in, they couldn't just shoot everybody along here, so that you can see how it kind of snakes along. A front listening post that went out into no man's land. But out here, with these burned trees and everything, this is where you knew you were going to die, right? If you were stupid enough to get out here, you would get murdered. And then you would have like your command HQ way back here and second trench and so forth. But they would fight over, sometimes people would, they would decide to have a push, run out into no man's land and try and take the next trench, right? And you might fight for maybe 100 yards of land, right? And lose many lives in the process. And so it just bogged down along this Western Front that was just covered with these trenches all along its length through here. And America, when it enters World War I, at the end of the war, 100,000 Americans will die. Now that's a lot, right? I mean, relative to all wars. Our worst war, with the Civil War, we lose 600,000. But in World War I, and in just like a year of fighting, we lose 100,000 soldiers. But 10 million people died in total during World War I, right? So the Europeans who were fighting this, a huge number of them died, right? And this dramatically shapes the way in which Europe's history unfolds afterwards. It takes on a certain direction and a certain flavor as a result of all this. So let me back up here for just a minute. I got time. Yes, okay. We're going to go through the 3-minute version of this. Okay, so what happens? How does America get involved? First of all, there is a passenger ship called the Lusitania. It's an English ship, and it gets sunk by a German U-boat. And it had a number of Americans on board, right? So 1,260 people die, which is a huge number. I think something like 100 of those were American. So this kind of outrages America. And it's interesting because what happens is that we come in without fighting. We are supporting, we are supplying, we are helping the Allied powers. Now, why do we help the Allied powers? The main reason being because we are white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, right? And so we associate with Britain and also France, who had been a longtime ally of us. And so those two we liked. And it was an issue for this guy William Jennings Bryan, who we talked about earlier. William Jennings Bryan ran for president 3 times, got close a couple times, but never quite made it. And, but when Woodrow Wilson is elected president, he makes him his Secretary of State over Foreign Affairs. And William Jennings Bryan really believed that America should be neutral, should stay out of foreign entanglements and so forth. But everybody else on Wilson's cabinet, Wilson included, were pretty pro-Britain. And so they, after the Lusitania issue, they really began to push hard on Germany. And Bryan thought it was so biased that he resigned. And he was replaced by a pro-British Secretary of State. But then Wilson kind of got Germany to concede that they wouldn't use their U-boats to sink any passenger ships. And then he was able to run for re-election on this promise, or it's really a statement when you look at it carefully. Wilson, who kept you out of the war, vote for him. And that appealed to a lot of Americans. Part of why he wins is because 10 of the 12 states, we don't have the constitutional amendment giving women the right to vote throughout the country, but 10 of the states that at the state level had given women the right to vote went for Wilson, right? In part because they really didn't like the idea of their sons or husbands going to war. And so on this promise, on this sort of idea of, hey, I kept you out of the war, he is able to get reelected, but almost immediately, thanks to this thing, which we'll talk about later, he gets us into World War I. And we'll talk about how that happens, the details of that next time. Bookmarks, they're book